Right now, you're either dreading Monday or counting down to Saturday. That 2-day break at the end of your week feels like a law of nature, something that's just always existed. It hasn't. The weekend you're planning your life around is barely 100 years old, and it wasn't discovered. It was fought for, negotiated, and eventually sold to businesses as a good idea. For most of human history, there was no such thing as a day off, let alone two. If you were a farmer, the animals didn't stop needing you on Saturday. If you worked in a pre-industrial trade, you worked when there was daylight and stopped when there wasn't. The idea of a fixed, guaranteed block of rest time simply didn't exist for the average person, and nobody was campaigning for one, because the entire concept hadn't been invented yet. The first real crack in that system came from religion, not economics. Jewish tradition established the Sabbath, a single day of mandated rest running from Friday evening to Saturday evening, rooted in the idea that even work itself needed a limit, a radical concept in the ancient world where labor was constant and unquestioned. Christianity later adopted Sunday as its day of worship and rest, partly to distinguish itself from Jewish practice, and partly because Sunday held its own symbolic weight as the day of resurrection. So by the early centuries of the church, you already had two different religious traditions, each insisting on a different single day of rest. Neither one was thinking about a 2-day weekend. They were thinking about one sacred day, and everything else was still fair game for labor. For over 1,000 years, that's roughly where things stayed. One day, sometimes loosely enforced, sometimes not, depending on where you lived and who was in charge. Some regions barely honored it at all, especially for peasants and laborers who couldn't afford to lose a day of income or a day of work in the fields. Then the Industrial Revolution arrived, and it made things dramatically worse before it made them better. Factories didn't care about sunrise and sunset the way farms did. A factory could run its machines at any hour, so owners ran them constantly. 6-day workweeks became standard. 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days became normal, including for children as young as 5 or 6 working in mills and mines, often in dangerous, poorly ventilated conditions. The 1 day of religious rest still technically existed on paper, but for a huge number of workers, it barely mattered. You had 1 day to recover from 6 days of brutal, often dangerous labor, and then you did it again, week after week, year after year, with no legal protection stopping employers from demanding more. This is where the second weekend day actually starts to enter the picture, and it didn't come from religion at all. It came from workers refusing to accept those conditions any longer. Throughout the late 1800s, labor movements across Europe and the United States began organizing around a demand that sounds almost quaint today: an 8-hour workday. The full slogan from labor organizers of the era captured it directly: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Strikes broke out. Some turned violent. The Haymarket affair in Chicago in 1886 began as a labor rally supporting the 8-hour workday movement and ended in bloodshed after a bomb was thrown at police, an event that would go on to inspire International Workers' Day, still marked around the world today. These weren't polite negotiations. People were risking their jobs, their safety, and sometimes their lives over the basic idea that a workday should have a limit. A second day off specifically was pushed for a very practical reason tied to religious diversity, especially in the United States. Jewish workers who observed a Saturday Sabbath were often forced to choose between their faith and their jobs, since Sunday was already the standard Christian day off. Labor advocates began pushing for both Saturday and Sunday to be free, partly as a fairness issue for religious minorities, and partly because reformers were realizing that workers who got more rest were less likely to get injured. But the moment that really cemented the 2-day weekend into modern life didn't come from a government or a church. It came from a car company. In 1926, Henry Ford did something that shocked much of the business world. He cut his factory workers' schedule from 6 days down to 5 without cutting their pay. On paper, this looked like generosity. In practice, Ford was running an experiment, and the data backed him up. Workers who got 2 full days off came back more productive, made fewer costly mistakes on the assembly line, and stayed in their jobs longer instead of burning out and quitting. Ford also understood something else, something that had nothing to do with kindness. Workers with more free time and steady pay were exactly the people who could afford to buy the cars his factories were building. A rested workforce wasn't just a happier workforce, it was a better customer base, and Ford said as much publicly at the time. Other major companies started watching Ford's results closely, and the 5-day workweek slowly started spreading, factory by factory, industry by industry, purely because it worked financially, not because anyone suddenly decided rest was a human right. The legal seal came over a decade later. In 1938, the United States passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established a federal maximum workweek and, alongside it, formally recognized the structure of the 5-day, 40-hour week for a huge portion of the American workforce. Similar labor laws followed in other industrialized countries over the following decades, each shaped by their own local labor movements, but generally converging on the same basic pattern: 5 days on, 2 days off. France, Germany, the UK, and eventually much of the industrialized world adopted comparable structures, though the exact timing and the exact hours varied by country and by how hard their own labor movements had to fight for it. It's also worth pointing out that the 7-day week itself, the container all of this fits inside, isn't some universal law of nature either. It traces back to ancient Babylonian astronomy and was later reinforced by Jewish and Roman traditions before spreading globally through trade, conquest, and eventually colonization. Plenty of other calendar systems throughout history use different cycles entirely, some with 10-day weeks, some with different structures altogether. The 7-day week just happened to be the version that stuck, largely because it was baked so deeply into religious practice that it outlasted almost every empire that tried to replace it. So even before you get to the question of why the weekend has 2 days, you're standing on top of a 7-day structure that was itself a choice made thousands of years ago by people deciding how to divide up time. So here's the actual sequence. Religion gave you one sacred day of rest over 1,000 years before anyone was thinking about weekends as we know them. The Industrial Revolution made work brutal enough that people were willing to strike, get arrested, and sometimes die demanding a limit on their hours. Religious fairness concerns pushed the idea of a second day specifically. And then a car manufacturer proved, with cold hard productivity numbers, that resting workers was more profitable than exhausting them. Governments didn't hand you the weekend out of kindness. They eventually caught up to what workers had already forced into practice and what businesses had already discovered paid off. Now think about your actual Saturday. That lazy morning, that lack of an alarm, that entire day that feels like it belongs to you and no one else. It isn't some natural feature of how time works. It's the physical result of religious tradition, violent labor disputes, one car company's productivity experiment, and a piece of federal legislation, all stacked on top of each other over more than 100 years. None of it guaranteed, and none of it inevitable. The 5-day workweek still isn't universal today, and it's not even settled history. Plenty of countries and industries run different schedules entirely, and plenty of workers, gig workers especially, don't get a guaranteed 2-day break at all. In recent years, some countries and companies have started experimenting with 4-day workweeks instead, running their own versions of Ford's old experiment, testing whether even more rest produces even better results. The version of the weekend you're used to is really just the version that happened to win in a specific place at a specific time for a specific set of economic reasons, and it may not be the final version at all. So next Saturday, when you're doing absolutely nothing and it feels completely normal, remember that it took strikes, a bombing, a car company's spreadsheet, and an act of Congress to make doing nothing on a Saturday feel normal at all.